Chapter 5. Hugo's Father. Hugo ran until he found himself back inside his secret room. He tried to turn on the light, forgetting, as he usually did, that the bulb in the ceiling had burned out. He struck a match, watched it flare, and lit a few candles. The room filled with a warm golden glow, and huge shadows rose against the walls. Instinctively, Hugo's fingers reached for the empty pocket where his notebook had been. Not knowing what else to do, he walked to a cluttered pile of boxes in the corner of his room and moved them to the side, revealing a hiding place in the wall. Hugo reached in and pulled out a large, heavy object. He untied the frayed ropes and unwrapped the fabric that covered it. The man was built entirely out of clockworks and fine machinery. From the very first moment his father had told him about it, the mechanical man had become the centre of Hugo's life. Hugo's father had owned a clock shop and worked part-time in an old museum taking care of the clocks there. One evening he had come home later than usual. "Captain," he had said to Hugo, who was already in bed, "sorry I'm so late, but I found something fascinating tonight at the museum. In the attic. Apparently no one at the museum knows how it got there. Even the old guard doesn't remember. But then again, he doesn't remember much of anything. It's the most beautiful, complicated machine I have ever seen. It's a shame that the museum didn't take care of it." "What is it?" Hugo asked. "An automaton." "What's that?" "It's a wind-up figure, like a music box or a toy, except it's infinitely more complicated. I've seen a few before, a singing bird in a cage and a mechanical acrobat on a trapeze. But this one is far more complex and interesting than those." "What do you mean?" said Hugo eagerly. "This one can write. At least I think it can. It's got a pen in its hand and it's sitting at a desk." I looked inside it and there are hundreds of little parts, including dozens of wheels that had edges cut with notches and grooves. I'm sure that if it were working, you could wind it up, put a piece of paper on the desk, and all those little parts would engage and cause the arm to move in such a way that it would write out some kind of note. Maybe it would write a poem or a riddle, but it's too broken and rusty to do much of anything now." "Who made it?" Hugo asked. No one at the museum knows, but the other automata I've seen were all built by magicians for use in their performances." "Magicians?" Hugo asked excitedly. "Some magicians started off as clockmakers. They used their knowledge of machines to build these automata to amaze their audiences. The sole purpose of the machines was to fill people with wonder, and they succeeded. No one in the audience could figure out how these mysterious figures danced or wrote or sang. It was as if the magicians had created artificial life, but the secret was always in the clockworks." "You're a clockmaker," said Hugo, "so you should be able to fix it." "I don't know about that. It's pretty badly rusted, and pieces are missing, and I've got the other things to fix." Hugo was good with clocks too. The talent ran in the family. Hugo's father had always brought home broken clocks for his son to play with, and by the time he was 6, Hugo was able to fix just about anything. Later, when he visited his father at the clock shop, Hugo watched him carefully, and then, when he grew restless, he made little mechanical animals out of the extra bits and pieces lying around. Hugo's father displayed the creatures proudly on his workbench. "Can I see the automaton?" Hugo asked. "Please." A few nights later, Hugo's father snuck him into the museum attic. In the dusty lights, Hugo saw broken model ships and heads of statues and old signs and piles of shattered doors. There were just glass jars filled with strange liquids and stuffed birds and cats frozen mid-leap on a wooden stand. At last his father lifted a stained white sheet, and there it was, the mechanical man. Hugo knew even then he would never forget the first time he saw it. The machine was so intricate, so complicated, that he almost got dizzy looking at it. Even in its sad state of disrepair, it was beautiful. "You can Hugo whispered. Don't you want to know what it can write? Then we'll wind it up and see what the message says. We'll see if I can get through my workload of broken clocks in the shop and the museum, Hugo, said his father. But even as he worked in his shop, Hugo's father must have kept thinking about the automaton. Soon Hugo's father had filled several notebooks with drawings of the automaton. He opened the automaton up and carefully disassembled it. He drew detailed pictures of its parts, then he cleaned them and patiently began to put it all back together. On Hugo's birthday, his father took him to the movies as he usually did, and he gave him one of his notebooks as a present. Meanwhile, Hugo's father grew obsessed with getting the automaton to work. He brought Hugo back to the museum a few more times and explained how the mechanisms operated. They remained optimistic that it could be fixed, and they talked about what the automaton might write once it was working again. Hugo and his father began to think of the automaton as an injured animal they were nursing back to health. One night, the old guard in the museum forgot that Hugo's father was up in the attic, and he locked the door, trapping him inside. Hugo had no way of knowing what happened next. No one knows how the fire started, but it rushed through the whole building in minutes. Hugo stayed up all night waiting for his father to come home. He had never been this late before. But when the door finally opened in the morning, it wasn't father. It was Uncle Claude. Pack your things quickly, nephew, Uncle Claude had said, his breath smelling of alcohol as usual. Uncle Claude lifted his tiny steel spectacles with one hand and wiped his bloodshot eyes with the other. Your father's dead, and as your only living relative, I'm taking you in. Hugo, who hadn't slept all night, barely understood what his uncle was saying. He remembered hearing the blood beating hard in his ears like the rhythm of a clock. In a trance, he put his clothes into a little suitcase, packed some of his tools and his deck of cards. He slipped his father's cardboard notebook into his pocket. As they walked through the freezing streets of the city, his uncle explained about the fire and the locked door. Hugo wanted to fall over, to just lie down on the sidewalk and disappear. This was all his fault. He had wanted his father to fix the machine, and now, because of him, his father was dead. You'll be my apprentice, he vaguely heard his uncle saying as they walked. You'll live in the station with me, and I'll show you how to take care of the clocks. Apprentice timekeeper. It's a good title for a boy, and besides, I'm getting too old to be climbing through the walls. A million questions floated through the fog in Hugo's mind, but the only one that he had finally said out loud was, what about school? Hugo's hand was still wrapped around the notebook in his pocket, and absent-mindedly he began to rub the cover with his forefinger. His uncle laughed. Ha, nephew, you're lucky. You are finished with school. There won't be time for it once you're in the walls of the station. You should thank me. Uncle Claude slapped Hugo on the back and said, You come from a long line of horologists. Your father would be proud. Now hurry up. Uncle Claude cleared his throat. He reached into his pocket, took out a greasy silver flask and drank from it. The word horologist had been painted on the door of father's shop. Hugo knew it meant clockmaker, and he had always thought he would be a clockmaker like his father. But after the discovery of the automaton, Hugo began to have other ideas. He wanted to be a magician. Hugo began to think about running away, but at that moment, as if reading his mind, Uncle Claude grabbed the back of the boy's neck and didn't let go until they reached the train station. And so Hugo began working all day in the dark on the clocks. He had often imagined that his own head was filled with cogs like gears in a machine, and he felt a connection with whatever machinery he touched. He loved learning how the clocks in the station worked, and there was a kind of satisfaction in knowing how to climb through the walls and secretly repair the clocks without anyone seeing him. But there was hardly ever any food to eat, and Uncle Claude yelled at Hugo, rapped his knuckles when he made mistakes, and forced him to sleep on the floor. Uncle Claude taught Hugo how to steal, which Hugo hated more than anything, but sometimes it was the only way to get something to eat. Hugo silently cried himself to sleep most nights, and he dreamt of broken clocks and fires. Soon, Uncle Claude began to disappear for hours at a time, leaving Hugo to take care of the clocks, twice each day, by himself. Sometimes his uncle didn't return until very late, and then one day Uncle Claude didn't come back at all. Hugo was afraid that his uncle would track him down if he left, but finally, on the third night that his uncle did not return, he decided to escape. He packed up his things and raced out of the station. He was hungry and tired, and had no idea where he would go. He made his way through the narrow streets, turning blindly, terrified he'd freeze to death before he found shelter. He looked down at his feet as he walked because the wind was bitter, and eventually Hugo found himself, quite by accident, in front of the ruins of the burned-out museum. All that was left of the building was a jagged brick wall with nothing behind the windows but black sky. The police had put up wooden barriers, but no one had begun to clean up the place. A huge pile of twisted metal, wooden planks and crumbled bricks lay in front, and then something in the wreckage caught Hugo's eye. There it was, like an accusation, reminding Hugo that everything in his life had been destroyed. He sat down and stared at it. A long time passed. Dogs barked in the distance, and the rumbling of the street cleaners pierced the quiet of the night. Where was Hugo supposed to go? What was he supposed to do? He had no one. Even the automaton was dead. He gathered up his few belongings and walked away, but he kept looking back at the ruined machine, and for some reason he couldn't leave it there. After all of his father's hard work, the automaton belonged to him. Hugo took a deep breath, went back and cleared away the charred debris. The automaton was heavy and in several pieces, but he picked it up and, not having anywhere else to go, returned to the dreaded station. It was a difficult trip back, with his belongings slung over his shoulder and the black and twisted remains of the automaton straining his arms and back. He didn't even know what he was going to do with this thing once he got it back to his room. Since it was late at night, he managed to drop it inside one of the air vents without anyone seeing him. It took several trips through the walls to get it all back to his room. When he finished, his hands were scratched pretty badly, and his arms and back ached. Hugo laid out all the pieces on the floor and washed his hands in the basin by the bed, which he refilled from the spluttering sink in his tiny kitchen. He stared at the misshapen pieces of metal and was thankful that his uncle still hadn't returned. Fix it. Hugo jumped. He could have sworn he heard a voice whispering in his ear. He looked for his uncle, but the room was empty. Hugo didn't know if it was his own thoughts or if it was a ghost, but he heard it clearly. Fix it. Looking at the automaton, Hugo didn't think he'd be able to do it. It was in far worse shape than before, but he still had his father's notebook. Maybe he could use his father's drawings as a guide to rebuild the missing parts. Increasingly, Hugo felt he had to try. If he fixed it, at least he wouldn't be so completely alone. Hugo knew could be dangerous to stay at the train station. His uncle could come back, and in the meantime, he was sure that if the station inspector knew he was there alone, he'd be locked up in the little jail cell in the office and then sent off to the orphanage. Then the automaton would probably be thrown away or destroyed. Hugo quickly realised he had to make it seem like his uncle was still around. He would keep the clocks running as precisely as possible, and he'd take his uncle's paychecks from the office when no one was looking, although he didn't know how to cash them. Most of all, Hugo would do his best to remain invisible. 3 months passed since then. Hugo ran his fingers along the arm of the automaton and gazed at its face. He had studied the drawings in his father's notebook closely and had made great progress. He had repainted the face himself, and it had the strangest expression. It reminded him of father, the way he always seemed to be thinking of 3 things at once. The newly polished wooden hand was now poised above the desk as it once was, waiting for Hugo to make it a new pen. Hugo had continued thinking about the note that it would eventually write, and the more he worked on the automaton, the more he came to believe something that he knew was completely crazy. Hugo felt sure that a note was going to answer all his questions and tell him what to do now that he was alone. The note was going to save his life. Whenever he imagined the note, he always saw it in his father's handwriting. Maybe father, while he had been working on the automaton up in the attic of the museum, had changed the little mechanical parts just enough so that it would make a new note, one meant just for Hugo. It was possible, after all.